Hello, welcome to the Azure Advent Calendar. My name's Jack Tracey and I'm a Solutions Architect in the UK, based down in Brighton. This is the first of 75 videos that you're going to see in the Azure Advent Calendar series. A big thank you to Gregor Suti and Richard Hooper for arranging this. 75 videos with 75 different people over the space of 25 days, arranging and uploading and getting this all organised has been no small feat, I'm sure. So a massive congratulations and for pulling this one off, and I'm sure everybody will thank you in the community for it. My session today is going to be on Azure Governance and giving you a bit of a 101, so all the different tools and services that are available out there and what you can do to use them and how you can utilise them to protect and set up your Azure environment in the correct way to ensure that things like costs don't get out of control and resources aren't spun up in regions and that you don't want to consume, and all of those really good best practice things that the Cloud Adoption Framework talks about, and also my personal take on them and what I do in my day-to-day job and with live customers on a daily basis. So let's get this kicked off with the first of 75 amazing videos from the Azure family. I've got my Christmas themed jumper on, being Pac-Man themed. Hopefully you can see that. It would only be right to be a nerdy jumper. I have looked for an Azure one. There are none available. However, if you do know of any, let me know. Okay, so let's get things kicked off with this Azure Governance 101. There's an awful lot of topics in the Azure Governance space, so we've had to whittle this down so we can keep it nice and concise and digestible for this short video. So let's have a look at what we're going to be covering today. So first off, we're going to be looking at some tags and my recommended tagging policy. Tags are really important to use regardless of what cloud you're using, so this can apply across any cloud that you're using today, whether that be Azure, AWS, GCP, Alibaba, whatever that is. We're then going to look into the Azure Governance scopes. The Azure Governance scopes are absolutely fundamental to understand around how you control your permissions, boundaries and policies in the Azure platform. We're then going to look into management groups. Management groups are a great way of controlling multiple subscriptions, and there's a few different models and architectures that you can follow depending on the type of business you've got. Then we're looking to role-based access control, which is the permissions and control boundary within Azure. So who can do what to what resources, and whether we're inviting guests in or using service principals or managed identities, they can all be controlled via role-based access control. We'll then do a quick brief overview of Azure Policy. Azure Policy is a tool that you can use to control what people can deploy and how people deploy those resources within Azure. So for instance, if you want to restrict your resources to only be deployed into UK South and UK West, you can do that with Azure Policy. And then put a deny policy in place that blocks your users from deploying anything to any other Azure region. Or you can use it to just check your resources and look for things like, are all of my VMs using managed disks? Have I got storage encryption enabled on all of my storage accounts, or have I got HTTPS enabled on all the storage accounts? And then finally, we're going to dive into a really quick demo about how we can use all of these things together to help control our Azure environments. Okay, so let's get going and looking at some tags. Tags are a really important thing to use in any cloud environment, whether that's AWS, Azure, or GCP or Alibaba, any of these cloud environments, they all support tagging. Tags are just key value pairs, and what I mean by key value pairs is they're just a name field and a value field, very short, very descriptive, but provide additional metadata on top of the resource themselves to help you work out a few things like who's the owner of that application, when they need to be online, is it production, is it dev, all of those sort of things. Azure refers to the key as the name field, but they are called key value pairs. They're supported by pretty much every resource in Azure today. There is an up-to-date list that is constantly changing with the link provided on screen. Easier than putting the Azure link in there. There's also a 50 tag limit per resource and per resource group. And at the moment, you can only put 15 tags on storage accounts. However, that may be changing in the future, I'd hope. Tag names can only be 512 characters in length, and for storage accounts, that's limited to 128 characters. Again, that should change in the future. And the tag names can't contain any of the following characters. So the pointy brackets, percentage signs, backslashes, question marks, forward slashes, and tag values, so the actual value that you want to put for your tag, can only be up to 256 characters in length. And finally, tags cannot be applied to Azure Classic resources or ASM-based resources. So another great reason to get on the ARM model and migrate your resources from Classic to the ARM-based model. So here are a few of my recommended tags. As you can see, there's not a massive list, but a concise list. And I think that's really important when you're defining a tagging policy for either your company or a business that you're working with, that it doesn't become overly taxing with your tags. So keep them short, concise, and try and cover a wide range of topics, but in a very small amount of tags. These are my recommended tags, as I've just said. And as you can see, we have an environment tag for production. We have an IT owner contact, because the IT owner of the resource may be completely different to the business owner contact that we got listed below. We have the hours that resource is operational, so whether that's 24/7 or specific hours during the day. And then we have the days that are operational, so whether it's every day, weekdays, Mondays, specific days of the week, that's there for you to define as well. We then have one that I've created called application taxonomy, which sounds like a lot, but actually it's really useful, I find, for my customers to break down, if they're especially a multi-geo company or multinational, breaking down the application and who it belongs to. So in this example I've got on the screen, it's the UK's finance, part of the payroll department inside of finance, and it's the Sage payroll application. So it's very easy to tag all the resources that are responsible for that application for that particular department to see and track costs, and also from a governance perspective to manage them all as one. You then got the service or application, so you can just put in there the application name, so Sage Payroll to follow the same example. Build to, so you can use this as the department or part of the business that you want to charge that to, so you can just add a tag for that. The build date and time, I think this is really important in cloud environments. A lot of things in the cloud can be built and left and forgotten, and we never really know how long it's been there, or does it need rebuilding? Has it been here 3 or 4 years? Do we need to review it? So adding the build date and time, I think, is a really important tag and key value pair to add to help us track that sort of information as well. And then finally, cost center. Some of your business units may have cost centers internally for the finance and billing operation, so putting those on the resources or the resource groups as well helps you easily give those reports to finance when they request them about which cost center is spending this much on these Azure resources. Okay, so let's look at some Azure governance scopes. The Azure governance scopes are absolutely fundamental to understand for any Azure application, whether that's for governance, for building applications, for security boundaries, any of those things. They're really important to understand as a fundamental layer. So there's 4 layers, excluding the Azure Active Directory tenant, as shown on screen. So at the very top we have management groups, and management groups help us control multiple subscriptions, and we'll dive into those in a little bit more detail in the next section. We then have subscriptions, which resources live within, and resource groups live within. There is a one-to-one relationship between a subscription and a management group, so a subscription can only be part of one management group at a time. We then have resource groups, and all of you should be familiar with these if you're deploying anything in Azure, because everything has to live within a resource group, and the resource groups are contained within a subscription. And you can have multiple resource groups, obviously, within a subscription. And then we've got the resources, so your VMs, your databases, storage accounts, all of the things that you deploy and use and help build applications with, all live within a resource group. And they, again, can only live within one resource group, and that resource group can only live within one subscription, and then that subscription can only live within one management group. So fairly complex to understand, but once you get your head around it, and hopefully the diagram helps with that, you should be okay. Management groups are used to group subscriptions together for simplified management. They can be used for the following Azure services and features, so RBAC, policy, blueprints, cost management. You can utilize management groups to give you different views or apply things at different levels for all of these services. You can nest management groups up to 6 levels deep. That excludes the root management group. And there's a one-to-one relationship between a subscription and a management group, as I've just said, but it's really important to understand. But you can move a subscription between management groups. So if you need to move a subscription between management groups to apply a different governance set of policies or different permissions, you can absolutely do that. It will just remove the permissions that have been inherited. Management groups are within an Azure AD tenant, so they can't span different Azure AD tenants at this time. So they can only contain the subscriptions that are linked to the same Azure Active Directory tenant. And here are some example architectures for management groups. So this is a fairly common thing we see for non-multinational companies who just want to separate, they don't provide any services to customers. They are literally just providing the services for their own company. So we create another management group below the root level called Global IT, and I like to put a shared services subscription there that can host all like the networking, NVAs, express routes, all those sort of things. And then we split out a management group per environment, so production, UAT, development, for example, and then linking subscriptions beneath all of those. So we can have multiple subscriptions, as we've seen got there in the production. We can have one subscription in the UAT, and then we can have, again, one or many subscriptions in development. And it's really important to note, as you may have noticed on the diagram, that they've all come from different commerce models. So we've got EA subscriptions on there, CSP subscriptions, pay-as-you-go subscriptions. EA obviously going to become MCA subscriptions. But yeah, you can mix and match your subscription commerce models in your management groups because they're just linked to your Azure Active Directory tenant. It doesn't matter about what billing platform they're coming from. And then getting a little bit more complex, we have this architecture which we do for a lot of our multinational customers that I work with, and we start to split that again. So we have a global IT management group again beneath the root with a shared services subscription there for the networking appliances for all regions, because that's generally controlled by one team and a very centralized and important security function that people don't want to give out to anybody to be able to control or work around. I then like to split it by continent, because that's very strict and there's no misunderstanding of where things should live. And then beneath that, I like to put it per country as a management group. So if we take Europe for an example, we've got Europe as a separate management group beneath the global IT level, and then we have the UK, France, and Greece that all live within Europe. And then, as you'll see, we have subscriptions linked beneath those for production and test. You could take that one level further and split them another level of management groups beneath the country or beneath the continent for production, dev, test, UAT. But this is what we quite commonly see as a good use case. Okay, so now we understand some management groups and the governance scoping architecture. Let's take a little bit of a look at role-based access control. So RBAC, or Role-Based Access Control, as it's formerly known, is the access management and the permissions layer across the whole of Azure. This is only focused around the Azure Resource Manager model, or R model, so what we've been used to for the last probably 3 or 4 years within Azure, before when Classic was replaced. Role-Based Access Control permissions can be applied to users, groups, service principals, or managed identities within your Azure Active Directory tenant, and that can also mean invited users via Azure AD B2B or B2C, so those guest users. So yeah, you can invite anybody in from any tenant to manage those resources. Really important to understand that they are different to Azure Active Directory roles. So things like Global Administrator and Exchange Administrator, which are more focused around the Microsoft 365 suite or Office 365 to manage those services, those permissions are completely different, those roles are completely separate from the Azure role-based access control permissions. So really important to understand that. They can be applied to all governance scopes, as we mentioned before, so the management group, subscription, resource group, or resource layer. so you can apply RBAC permissions at any one of those layers, and we'll get into some scenarios in a minute about inheritance and how that all works. There are over 70 built-in roles, and they're always adding more as new services get released or feature updates from the community come out. You can build your own custom roles if none of those built-in ones meet your requirements. But a really key point to know that is if you use management groups and you want to assign roles to management groups, custom roles cannot be assigned to management groups at this time. But that is something that I hope they're working on. So try and use the built-in ones wherever possible. I've never really come across the scenario where we've had to build a custom role. We can get away with using the built-in ones and building them all together, so adding multiple roles to give you the permissions that are required. And then there are 4 fundamental roles that we have. So we have the owner role, which is effectively full access to all resources, and it can assign other users, service principals, group permissions on resources also that it has access to. Contributor has full access to all the resources that it's applied to again, but at this time it cannot assign other users, groups or service principals permissions on those resources. So it's very similar to owner, apart from it can't assign permissions to any other users. Then we've got reader. It pretty much does what it says on the tin. It just provides read access to all of those resources that they are given permissions over. And then we have user access administrator, which is a really important role to understand. So it doesn't give you access to any Azure resources, but it does let you manage RBAC permissions and assignments based on where that user access assignment RBAC role has been assigned. Just to really emphasise this point, that RBAC role assignments are automatically inherited downwards from the Azure Governance scope level they're applied to. So if you apply something at the management group layer, that's going to affect the subscription, the resource group, and all the resources beneath that are automatically going to inherit all those permissions that you've assigned at the management group layer. And to help show that and to help you understand that, the next slide hopefully will help you uncover that. So if we take an example user here, say we've got Dave, who we're going to give owner permissions at the management group layer. Once we've assigned that, actually he will then get permissions over all of the resources, because that management group has all the subscriptions beneath it, all of those resource groups and all the resources beneath it. So by giving Dave permissions at the management group layer, in this example from the governance scope diagram that I created, he'll get permissions, owner permissions over all of those by default. So what happens if we assign permissions at a subscription level instead of a management group level? Well, let's say we give Jane permissions, owner permissions at the subscription level on the right hand side subscription in this example. She'll only get permissions over that resource group that is within that subscription and those resources that live within that resource group. So it's really important to understand that everything inherits down. Just understand that and you'll be absolutely fine. Another key point is that you can apply deny permissions to overwrite these, but you can't disable inheritance at all. So you have to use deny permissions instead of disabling inheritance if you need a custom permission boundary that you've got a fairly good template assigned at your management group layer, and then there's one user that you don't want to be able to do a specific thing on a specific resource or resource group. That's where you would use a deny permission to stop that user from doing that particular thing. So my best practices and tips for role-based access control: use the least privileged administrative model. So only give people permissions they absolutely need to be able to do. Don't go and give everybody owner permissions. Don't even go and give them all contributor permissions. Use the governance scope, so management groups, subscriptions, resource groups and resources, as well as the roles, to absolutely fine-tune your permissions to what is actually required. So if somebody only needs access to the networking resources, if they're all within one resource group, only give them access within that resource group. But if you want them to be able to manage all the networking resources, no matter where they are in what subscription, then maybe give them the network contributor role at a management group layer that has access over all of those subscriptions, and therefore it will be inherited down. Use the built-in RBAC roles as we mentioned earlier, wherever possible, because custom roles aren't supported with management groups. Use groups instead of users wherever possible, even if it means creating one group that has one user in for the time being. In the future, when you then need to add another user to have the same permissions, instead of having to go back and add all those individual permissions of whatever governance scope layer, you can just add them to the group and your job's been done. Use the Azure Governance scope to simplify those assignments. So as we mentioned for the first point, use the inheritance to your advantage. So assign it at the top level root management group, and they'll get permissions all over. Use only the deny assignments where absolutely required. It can make it really hard to troubleshoot for certain people when they're trying to work out why a user can't do certain things to a resource when they're trying to look through all the roles that have been assigned to those resources and been inherited. So only use them where they're absolutely required. And finally, ensure that your users, whether they've got create, update, delete permissions, make sure they have MFA enabled. And obviously with the announcements from Ignite that MFA is now free with the security defaults on every Azure AD tenant, it may well be worth something going to enable. Or go and, if you've got Azure Active Directory premium licenses already, go and enable that. There is no excuse. Go and enable MFA right now. And finally, we're going to cover some Azure policy. As mentioned at the beginning, Azure policy is a great tool to help you govern and control your Azure environment and make sure that people are using it in the correct way. And even if they're not, stopping them from doing things that will potentially get your business into trouble, like not having encryption enabled and opening firewall rules to allow any traffic, etc., etc. So Azure policy helps you stay compliant with all those policies. It's actually used by Azure Security Center, so it was a change I think about 6 to 9 months ago, where Azure Security Center actually started using Azure policy to enforce all the checks that it makes against your environment to advise you on compliance for industry-specific frameworks like ISO 27001, PCI, DSS, and now we've got UK official and UK NHS standards in Azure Security Center if you're not aware. So go and check those out. But they're all applied from Azure policy. I really believe in they should be used to apply guardrails instead of becoming blockers and obstacles for people using the Azure platform to deliver services and applications within your business. So you should treat it in a way that you don't want to be obstructive with your policies. So don't try and use a lot of deny effects, which we'll come on to in a second, but try and use them so that it just keeps your business on track and compliant without becoming obstructive. You can check both the Azure platform, so things like VNets, network security groups, PaaS-based services, storage accounts, SQL databases, all those sort of things. But now you can also actually check inside of settings inside of your virtual machines for certain supported operating systems. So Windows Server 2012 upwards, I think, is supported, and there's various flavors of distributions of Linux that are supported for this as well, where you can install an agent on that VM, whether it's desired state configuration with Windows, or I think they're using a Chef agent on Linux distributions to check for settings inside of that VM to see if you're also compliant from there. So you can think of it as a replacement for group policy, which is a really interesting concept that I think we'll see evolve over the next few years. There's some key terms to understand with Azure policy. The first being definitions. So these are the individual bits of code for looking for specific settings. So you can have a definition that looks for whether your storage account has got HTTPS enabled. You then have initiatives. So initiatives are groups of definitions. So you can group all of your separate policies, which are also referred to as definitions, together in an initiative. And then you have assignments, which finally allow you to assign those definitions or initiatives to a relevant governance scope, as we spoke about earlier. So management groups, subscriptions, or resource groups. You can't assign them to individual resources, but you would never want to either. As I've just said, you can apply them at all those various governance levels. They are also able to be excluded, so you can exclude specific resource groups, subscriptions, or management groups from specific assignments if you need to. They are defined as JSON files, so they look very similar to ARM templates if you're used to using those. But yeah, they have a different schema, so there's a few tweaks that you need to make in terms of how they're constructed. And there's actually a Visual Studio Code extension available now for authoring policies and making changes to them and testing them out, and also for resource alias support. So as mentioned earlier, there's a few effects for Azure policy. So let's just go through those effects that are available. So the first effect that we have is an append effect. These are all on assignment, by the way. So this is assessed during a resource creation or an update. and it looks to add additional properties to a deployment that's missing. So if, say, for instance, somebody misses the public IP address of your office from the network firewall on a SQL database or a storage account, this policy will add that into the template when it's being deployed so that it's not missed and it's added automatically for you. You then have audit, which I think is probably the most common effect to use today, where it's again done at the time of creation or update of the resource, but it's just looking at what's being looking for certain properties and certain values, but it's not going to restrict anything from being deployed. So even if somebody's doing something that you potentially don't want to be allowed, this effect is going to let them deploy it, but it will then alert you and say it is a non-compliant resource. You then have deny. Deny is pretty much as it says on the tin. It looks for specific settings, properties and values, and will deny them from being created if it matches the policy. So if you stop people from being able to deploy to a specific region, if that location is seen in the template, so be it Southeast Asia or North Europe, for instance, you can restrict those from being deployed to, all from a policy. We've then got audit if not exists, which is a bit of a mouthful, but it's looking for things that don't exist within a template. So say you deploy a VM, and as part of the default install, you always want to make sure a certain extension's installed. Well, if somebody submits a template or a deployment for a VM that doesn't have that extension as part of the deployment, you can get this policy to tell you that, or this effect of policy to tell you that that's missing from the deployment. There's another 3 of these effects, so we'll just quickly rattle through those as well. So we've got deploy if not exists, so very similar to the last one, audit if not exists, but this time, if that extension was missing from the VM, it would actually adjust the once that VM has been deployed, it would then submit another template and put that extension in place for you. So there is some permissions that are required for that. And the example I've got here is, if you were to deploy somebody was to deploy an Azure SQL database successfully, but they didn't enable TDE, and that was part of your policy with a deploy if not exists effect, this policy would then check for that, see that TDE has not been enabled, and it would go and enable it for you. We've then got the disabled effect, which is a fairly new effect. It's used for testing policies that have parameterized effects. So what I mean by that is you've got a parameter in there that says the type of effects to apply as part of the definition or the initiative. It allows you to disable it on a single assignment basis. So it's for more complex policy deployments. I've used it a couple of times, but I've not used it in Anchor much yet. You could also set the enforcement mode of the policy to disabled to receive a similar outcome at assignment time. And the last effect, that is also another fairly new one, probably within the last 6 months, is modify. Modify is only to be used for tag management at the moment via policy. So when a resource is created or updated, and if there are certain tags that are missing or they're incorrect, or you don't want people to add different tags to what you've defined as part of a policy, as we spoke about as the first part of this talk, then you can use the modify effect to manage those tags on your resources. Okay, so that's all of the content for all of the features and services that we're going to discuss today in this video. Let's get into some demos and jump straight into the Azure portal and see how we can apply what we've learned in action. Okay, so let's first of all get kicked off by creating some tags. So for this, let's just create a dummy resource group and a VNet. So let's just create a resource group. Let's put this in that subscription, and let's just call this Azure Admin Resource Group 01, and let's pop that in West Europe. And we'll just do a view and create for now. We won't worry about doing the tags. We'll cover that in a sec. Perfect. So we've got our resource group, and let's add in a VNet. All looks good in that resource group, and let's call that perfect. So we'll create perfect. Obviously, the VNet resource provider is one of the quickest, so it's a good resource to use for demoing. As you can see, we've already got that created. Okay, so if we now go and find that resource group, and we filter by Advent, that will help us find that. Okay, so we've got our resource group here. So if we look in the Azure portal, very high up in the blade options, we've got tags. Tags are here, and as we can see, we can create a key value pair for whatever we like. So I've got a few in here. It also remembers all the ones you've ever created and are applied to other resources. So as you can see, we've got an IT owner contact one that we mentioned in my recommended tags. And it also remembers the values that you've entered, so it makes it nice and easy to keep repeating the tags that you're using. So there we go, we can add that, and let's also add one of cloud, and we can call this one Azure, definitely not AWS, and that's it. So we've got a couple of tags there, and if we click save, and that's now it. The tags are now applied. If we go back to that overview page, you'll also see the tags here. And you can filter by these, so they're really handy to start looking at. So if we create another tag for the purposes of this demo, just call it Azure Advent Resource, and just put that as yes. Yes, you can't also have the word Azure in your tag names, which is a really good thing to show you. So you can't have Azure, Microsoft, or Windows in your tag name. So if I just call this Advent Resource and say yes, that'll update the tags. Okay, so now we've got those tags applied to the resource group. If we look at the VNet, you'll see that they don't automatically inherit downwards. So if we look here, there's no tags applied to this VNet, and if we look at the overview blade as well, there's no tags here. So if you want, you can enforce that, and that's a great reason to use Azure policy to help you inherit that. A lot of people choose sometimes to use resource groups as the lowest level that they're going to apply tags. That's absolutely fine as well. It's completely dependent on your resource. If you're grouping things into resource groups that are the sort of lowest level billing bucket or administrative boundary that you want to use, and you're putting all the resources of the same application or the same type into that resource group, then it does make sense to just tag the resource group instead of tagging each individual resource. However, you can absolutely tag each individual resource. So if we again use the tag, so it's an Advent resource, yes. If we put the IT only contact again as me, and let's put the cloud as Azure. Really easy to create those tags there. Click save, and that's it. The tags are there created. Let's just look at those governance scopes that we've spoken about. So obviously we've been looking at resource groups, but if we remember, the very top level is management groups. So if we go and search for management groups, we select that. As you can see, I've got an array of management groups here, and I've already created it. When you haven't got any management groups created, you just get a big button in the middle that says create management group. So, and it will create your tenant root group for you. The tenant root group is created automatically for you, as we showed on that diagram. And you can rename that as in its display name. So let's just rename mine to JT tenant root group, JT MSDN, because it helps me understand that, and click save. Now, it's saying I've got an error here, and that's because the account I've logged in with doesn't have the relevant permissions to be able to edit the management group. So if I look to go into the tenant root group, as you can see, all of the other management groups I've got are a child of the root group, and you can apply your permissions here. So you can click on access control, and I can apply permissions at this level, and as you can see, I've got one user here called backdoor admin, which is my break glass account that has user access administrator permissions, so it can't access any resources, but it can manage permissions applied at this resource. That means that because it's applied at the tenant root group, all of these other management groups automatically inherit that role-based access control application. So if we were to go into my pay-as-you-go subscriptions management group, I like to split my management groups up depending on the type of subscription because it helps me out. And I look at the details of this management group, and I'll go into access control. As you'll see under role assignments, we have a backdoor admin, but it's inherited from a management group, and that will give you the management group ID as well if you hover over that, or if you click on it, it will take you to the correct management group. And there we go, we've been linked back to the tenant. Let's create a dummy management group just so that you can see the process of that. So we're back at my tenant root group. It's really important if you want to probably see me click details. That's the way you access the management group displayed to apply permissions and policies at that level. Hopefully they'll change that and make that a bit more obvious in the future, but for now that's absolutely fine. So if we want to add a new management group under the tenant root group, let's do that. So click add, and let's just call, you have to give it a management group ID, and as you can see I've got some IDs here. So if I follow my standard, and let's just call this Azure Advent event. And then on the display name, and it's important that you can't change the ID of a management group, but you can change the display name at any time. So let's just call this test, and then we'll rename it. So click save there, and we'll let that create. And great, okay, so that's created, and as you can see, the ID of JTJ management group Azure Advent has been created, and it's below that tenant root group. You can move them around, so if I put it in the wrong management group and I need to move it around levels, I could do so. Let's do that for this one. So let's pop it below my dev test subscriptions management group. We should see that disappear from this blade in a second. There we go, it's gone. And now if we go into our dev test subscriptions management group, you see we've got that test management group that we created just there. Let's go and rename that. So if we click on it and then click the details button, we can click rename group, and let's call this Azure Advent Management. Not having a good day with typing there. Management group, and click save, and we'll let that update. There we go, we can see it's been renamed, and now if we went back up to that dev test layer, we'd also see there it's been renamed to the Azure Advent Management Group. To move subscriptions into a management group, if you just find the subscription at whatever layer that is, and that can be either in the same management group level or hierarchy, or at a different one. So for instance, if I wanted to move one of my pay-as-you-go subscriptions that I've got into that management group, I could literally click move, pop it into the new management group, and then I move it from there. So as I've got a subscription already under my dev test subscriptions, let's go and move that one because it'll be slightly quicker. So as you can see, I've got a dev test subscription here. So if I click move, and I select its new management group as the Azure Advent Management Group, and click save, there we go. That subscription is now part of that Azure Advent Management Group. And if we go onto that subscription and we click on access control and IAM and role assignments, you'll see here that we've got that backdoor admin that was applied to the tenant root group applied automatically. And so this cannot be removed. If I try and remove that role, you can't, because inherited role assignments cannot be removed. So therefore, if this was applied from your users, they couldn't actually remove that permission, which is absolutely fantastic. So management groups are now covered, and we've looked into RBAC there. Very quickly, let's just look at RBAC in a bit more detail. So if we were to add a level of permissions here, and I go add and role assignment, look at all of these roles that we've got available to us. There are 70 plus, as I mentioned. You know, whether that's from a virtual machine user login, a contributor, somebody who can just add stuff to web plans, storage blob owners. There's a role pretty much for anybody out there. So network contributor is quite a good one. So and if you hover over the little eye, it gives you a bit of a brief description about all of those. But the link back in my presentation will give you full details on what all of those roles can do. And then, as you can see here, so Azure Active Directory, user group or service principal, or a user assigned managed identity, or a system assigned managed identity. So I've actually got a logic app that's got a managed identity, not within this subscription, so it will be within this one. And there we go, I've got a managed identity for a logic app here that I could give network contributor permissions over this subscription. And it's that easy, so click save. And there it is, that managed identity now has network contributor permissions over this resource. However, if I apply that at the tenant root group level in my management group hierarchy, that'll apply over all my subscriptions. So let's go and do that as well. So role assignments, add role assignment, and let's go let's just do reader for the time being. It is a logic app, and it lives within this subscription, and there we go. So reader permissions for a logic app managed identity that lives within this subscription, and this is the logic app itself. Click save there, and there we go. That has now got reader permissions at the tenant root group level. So if we were to go into my subscriptions, And let's look at one we haven't looked at before. So let's look at my CDW subscription and look at access control and IAM and role assignments. And if we look in here for LAP, there we go. We can see that Logic app managed identity has permissions over this subscription with reader permissions, and it was inherited from the management group. Let's take that one step further. So let's go and look at a resource within that subscription. So I know I've got some virtual machines in there. And let's just make sure it's inside the right one. So one of my Windows virtual desktop nodes. If we look in there and we click on access control and IAM and role assignments, and we look for Logic app again, there we go. It's inherited all the way down to the resource layer. So from the top the tenant root group management layer to the subscription, through the resource group and to the resource, it's applied all the way through and cannot be removed at any of these levels. So if I click on that and click remove, I get the same message as we saw before, where it's not allowed to be removed because it's inherited role. And that's management groups and RBAC pretty much summed up. Okay, so let's look at Azure policy. So if we just go and find policy, and you see a nice little overview blade here of your resource compliance based on all the policies you set. I've just got a few defaults. You see these ASC default ones. These are the security center policies that are being applied. So you can amend these, but it's easy to do via the security center blade to edit those. So if we look at the definitions, you'll see that there's a load of built-in definitions here. So you can filter by category, which is highly advised. So if we were just to look at, let's look at some networking ones. Here we go. So you can see all these different bits and pieces, different policies that for networking. So you can see all these different policies for the networking resources. So network interfaces shouldn't have public IPs, disable IP forwarding, all of those sort of things. Azure VPN gateway shouldn't use the basic SKU, all really good things to block. Or let's just say we want to look at, let's just look at tags. And there's some ones here. So if we say require specified tag on resource groups, that's quite a good one. So if we look at here, you can see it's a JSON object. And it's looking for the tag name that we specify but as a parameter, and it's saying if it's a resource group and it doesn't contain the tag name that we specify, then deny it. So let's assign that policy. So if we assign that to one of my subscriptions, as you can see, you can assign it at management group levels here, but we're just going to assign it to one of my subscriptions very quickly. So let's assign it there, and let's just hit select. We can also select exclusion. So if I wanted to exclude one of my resource groups, I could select that here. But we won't do that for demo purposes. So let's just come out of there. And let's just call this CDW. So require specified tag on specified resources. We'll look for that cloud tag that we've been using. Actually, let's look for the Azure Advent tag. And then it's applied to CDW. So looks for Azure Advent tag existence in CDW subscription, and that's enabled there, and we set the policy enforcement to enabled, whereas we could set disabled as per the talk earlier. What's that tag that we're looking for? So Azure Advent, and obviously it's going to be very case sensitive and making sure our spelling correct there when we're applying this. We could set this to have a remediation task and a managed identity associated with it, so it can go and deploy things. But as this policy doesn't contain any role definitions, the deploy if not exist is not really required for this, so we can skip that. And we just look there, that all looks good, and let's click create. Okay, and as you can see, that policy has been assigned. So if we go back to the policy definitions and then go back to the assignments blade, we'll see here that our policy has been assigned to the scope here, and it's ready to be tested. Now, it can take some time for policies to just get going. It can take somewhere like 15 minutes for them to actually get started. So it may be worth waiting here. As you can see, it says not started. So we'll give it a go, but we may have to wait for it. So if I go and try and create a resource group in that subscription without that tag of Azure Advent, it should get denied. I'll select the create subscription. advent test RSG, and it doesn't matter where I'm going to deploy this. Let's leave those tags off, and let's click create. And there we go. It was resource advent was disallowed by policy, and it's not very descriptive at the moment. The error messages, that is something they are working on. When I spoke to the product team at Ignite, but it's good enough, and it's doing its job, right? It's preventing your users from being able to create resources that are not compliant with your policy. Just very quickly, if we go back into the policy blade, if we looked at the other definitions, you can create an initiative, and these are groups of definitions, as we mentioned. So you just keep searching for all of your policies. So we set where our initiative needs to be created. So if we said it's going to be within this subscription, and we just call this test I, and then you can add all of these definitions that you can search for. And again, you can filter by whatever, or we can look for, say, location is a good one. So allowed locations, we can add that to an initiative and build in a group of policies effectively to assign as one thing instead of assigning individual policies or individual definitions to all of your different scopes. So initiatives are a good way to group definitions together. If we come back out of there, and finally, yeah, as I was just showing there, we've got the location one. So I think it's under the general. And these are some very handy policies to apply. So allowed locations, so restricting the regions that your resources can use. The allowed resource types, if you want to block things like data lakes or certain virtual machine SKUs or stuff like that. These are some of the policies to do. I think the virtual machine SKU one is actually under virtual machine. So let's just go and find that. And that probably is under compute. Yeah, and there we go, allowed virtual machine SKUs. So this is quite a good policy. If you click assign, you actually get a drop down list. So let's just quickly show you that. So choose a subscription, go next, and then you get a list of all of the SKUs that are available, and you can just select the SKUs that you want to let your users use and apply that at the relevant scope. So it's a good way of also controlling those costs by not letting your users deploy machines that they're never going to need to use, like the N series, for instance, if you're not doing any graphics intensive work, etc., etc. But that's your policy in a really quick way. Go and give it a go. Set the policies to audit mode so you don't impact any of your users, and once you're confident, start using the other effects like deny, deploy if not exist, and all those sort of things. But that's policy.